Hello and welcome to the third instalment of our ethics episode. This one we're looking for a little while at meta-ethics, which is kind of the grammar of ethics, looking beyond the more limited normative ethical theories we've been discussing so far. And then we're going to move on to ethics today, where it is in academia and in the public consciousness. And lastly, to our thoughts and opinions over what we've been learning over the course of the last two instalments.
It's basically the main nowadays it's like the main thing that academics focus on. So should I move on to metaethics?
Oh, definitely. Do you want to give an introduction to what it is and generally then, and then give just a few few different thoughts? So on. Just do your thing. You
Okay.
love meta-ethics, so you go.
Yeah, I mean I'll definitely leave some parts to you. I'll leave most of it to you actually. I don't know. We'll figure it
You
out.
have most
But
of it. You know the most about it.
but you know you gotta have balance, Tom.
But do
Anyway,
you gotta have balance though? Where does that come from? Where's the idea that we
what is
should
this?
have
What is
balance?
this? What is this?
Are there
Balance.
are there
What?
some moral laws saying we should have balance, just existing objectively, or what?
Well, Tom, if I were dominating the conversation, perhaps I would be doing so selfishly, and I would be going against the virtue of you know, being respectful. Anyway, metaethics. It's the study of ethics, and it's not just a study of ethics. It's a
Thank
study
you
of
for that.
questions about ethics. There's ethics, which is stuff like normative ethics, which is stuff like it's like normative ethics, which is like how we should act. There's meta ethics, which asks stuff like, what do we mean when we provide moral statements, or can there be real moral truths in the world, or what do we mean when we say goodness, or whatever else. What is goodness?
And where
Or,
do we get the
question,
knowledge of that from?
where do we get the knowledge from? And that provides itself to essentially three different disciplines within meta-ethics. You have moral semantics, moral ontology, and moral epistemology. So moral semantics is about the language of our ethical statements. So when someone says, for example, a meta-ethical question that's in the realm of moral semantics might be, when someone says murder is bad, are they expressing a truth they're trying to portray about the world, as in something that can be evaluated as true or false, or are they expressing an emotion, but pretending as if it were a fact in how they phrase it? And this divides people who talk about moral semantics into the fields of ethical cognitivism and ethical non-cognitivism. And another part we were talking about is moral ontology. Moral ontology is the study of, ontology is the study of existence, right?
The study of being, I'd say, rather than existence.
So the being, not the existence, but the being of things.
So moral ontology, therefore, is whether these moral truths be...
the nature of them, is the nature of our moral judgment, is it something to be held universally, or is it something to be held relatively, essentially? There's also other inquiries within ontology, such as the nature of our values. Do we have essentially value monism versus value pluralism? Is there one objective value we should base morality on, or is there several? Which is quite an interesting idea. And then there's obviously the final one, moral epistemology, which is the question of where does moral knowledge come from, and is moral knowledge possible? And that divides into ideas of people who invoke naturalism, empiricism, people who try to invoke the a priori, people who try to say,
So, sorry,
actually, we don't
what's
know
a
anything.
priori? Sorry, I don't think we've mentioned that. What it actually is.
A priori, a priori and a posteriori, they're two distinctions within philosophy that concern the idea of where knowledge comes from. And a priori says knowledge can come from pure reason. So an a priori piece of knowledge might be something like 1 + 1 = 2, because 2 is defined as the product as the sum of 1 + 1. On the other hand, empirical knowledge, which is what a posteriori knowledge essentially is knowledge we see from the world. So a posteriori knowledge, for example, might be the fact that the sun, the claim that, oh, so I know the sun rises in the morning and goes down in the evening, because I see it every day and I just have that knowledge. That's an a posteriori piece of knowledge. I mean, but it's not as verifiable as a priori knowledge, because a priori knowledge is necessarily true. It's truth by necessity, because we know it works in the laws of logic.
Yeah.
1 + 1 = 2. It cannot be anything but 2. But a posteriori knowledge, which is empirical knowledge, is very interesting in the sense that the sun could choose not to rise tomorrow for some reason we do not know. It may be a scientific reason, and therefore the sun rises could be an incorrect claim, in the a posteriori sense. So yeah, that's the distinction between a priori and a posteriori.
Brilliant.
And some people believe that through pure reason you can reach moral knowledge.
So that's
well,
exactly
in a
what
sense,
Kant. That's exactly what
That's
Kant did.
that's
I
essentially
think I
what that's
mentioned that
essentially what
before.
Kant tried to do.
Um,
Kant essentially tried to do that, moral rationalism.
So sorry,
also-
can I just briefly say, so the one form of moralist epistemology is moral rationalism. There's also empiricism as well. Empiricism is kind of what the utilitarians kind of tried to do by looking at what was the suffering of others and seeing if they could get moral facts from that. Rationalism is what Kant did through introspection, through reasoning, and thus trying to obtain moral truths like that. Sorry, you go, Sully. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. Well, since we've already settled ourselves in the realm of moral epistemology,
It's the hardest one to pronounce. Metaphysics
It is.
and ethics are very easy. Epistemology.
Yeah, let's mention some of the moral epistemologies. For God's sake, epistemologies.
Epistemology. Yeah.
Epistemologies.
Viewer, if you
can't even
can
pronounce it.
tell us how to pronounce it, we will give you
Epistemologies.
30% of our of this episode's proceedings, which will be £0. So no, because we're not monetized, and that was a joke.
Epistemology.
If we made money from this, we're not giving it to you anyway. So
Okay.
breaking the virtues of altruism there. Yeah.
So epistemologies, some of them. Yeah, we've already talked about the ethical naturalists who try to look at empirical natural elements of the world and say we can derive moral knowledge from them. For example, someone who says, look at this animal that sacrifices its life to save the pack. Therefore, we see an element of morality. Now, of course, there is a fallacy there in jumping from one statement to the other, but some people do believe that. There's also the belief of ethical subjectivism, which we'll talk about later, actually. So I'll leave that until later. But it also includes. So go ahead.
Ethical subjectivism is not a form of moral epistemology, though.
Yeah, but it can apply to the field of moral epistemology.
Yes, that's what you were saying. Sorry, that was my bad.
Because we'll cover the ethical subjectivists later, but they essentially believe that moral facts are facts about our attitudes to certain situations on a subjective level. And so, if we study someone and they say murder is bad, and they genuinely feel on the inside that murder is bad, then we would have empirically proven that that claim was true. It's a very weird system, but we'll talk about it later. And there's also the moral skeptics who believe skeptics actually, who believe that
we're not having a good pronunciation day today, are we?
Yeah, exactly. There's the moral skeptics who believe that actually no one has any moral knowledge, because we have no basis to know if anyone actually has the correct knowledge or not. And some people even go further and they go into moral nihilism, which is the belief that there actually are no ethical beliefs. No moral truths at all. So that's a view. Sorry, I'm having some stuff going on in the background, but anyway, we'll move on. So that's a moral epistemology. I don't know if I covered that adequately. There's also the belief in as you would
ethical
say,
intuitivism, yeah.
Ethical intuitivism, which is the belief that actually we don't need a rational empiricist basis for our beliefs in what's right and wrong. We can just use our intuitions of what we feel on the inside, which is also another epistemological view. So moral semantics is just as you said before, the study of moral language and what do we mean when we express moral statements. And there's a divide here between the cognitivists, the moral cognitivists, and the moral non-cognitivists. So the moral cognitivists believe that when you say something like murder is wrong, you're trying to express a statement about the world. You're trying to say murder has the quality of being wrong. On the other hand, the moral non-cognitivists believe. The moral non-cognitivists believe that when you say something like murder is wrong, you're not actually saying murder has the quality of being wrong. You're saying I feel such about murder, and something like boo on killing, or I don't like killing or whatever.
Yeah, well,
it's very different.
Yeah, you're not expressing a proposition. You're expressing your emotion.
You're not expressing an actual fact about the world that can be evaluated true or false. You're expressing an emotional attitude, as the emotivists will say. So we'll talk about that later. But so should we go into cognitivism first, because it makes more sense?
Yeah, we've got to do this. We've got to do this quite quickly because I think
yeah.
We could spend hours on this.
Yeah. So the ethical cognitivists essentially believe that. So that when you say something like stealing is bad or murder is bad, you're actually expressing a truth about the world, or a proposition.
Yes. So now we need to know: do those propositions actually exist? So that you get the division internally. It kind of crosses the borders. There's lots of various different definitions, but between realism and anti-realism, you go, Sully. Sorry.
So there's the moral realists who believe that when you say something like murder is bad, not only are you trying to express a fact of the world that can be evaluated true or false, but there actually is an evaluation objectively that is correct there to do, to say that it is true or false, that somewhere in the world lies the answer of yes, murder is objectively bad.
So that could be through ethical naturalism. So looking at the world around us and going, well, the suffering that murder causes is bad, or it destroys our natural purpose, which we can see, or it could be through, non-naturalism, which, you can have intuitive or a priori awareness of these truths. Sorry, keep going. Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, and then there's the error theorists, who essentially believe you have moral realism, then you have moral anti-realism, who reject there's actually objective truths about the world and its morality, even though they do believe that
ethical statements are propositions,
expressing propositions. So you have the ethical subjectivists and the error theorists. Ethical subjectivism, actually, I want to leave this to you because I think you know more than me about it, and you can talk about divine command theory or ideal observer theory or whatever it is. But error theories I'll talk about. So error theory was presented by J.L. Mackie, he was actually a very influential philosopher. He's known actually for his critiques of theism as well. But essentially, J.L. Mackie was a cognitivist. He said that when you say murder is bad, you're trying to say murder has the quality of being bad. And what he said there was, whenever you do that, you make an error, because we don't actually have murder doesn't have that quality of being bad as part of its substance of reality. We are making an error in pretending like murder has that quality of being bad. And as such, J.L. Mackie believed every moral statement to be false, to be incorrect, and to be an error, which is why it's called error theory. He was an atheist, and the way he explained this was, just as an atheist, when they hear the statement, God loves you, would evaluate that to be incorrect because, the world lacks a God to render that statement true, murder is wrong is also incorrect because there is no quality of murder in the world inherent to... there's no quality of badness inherent in the world that one can actually make that claim. But yeah, that's...
It's a pretty depressing prospect.
Yeah. I'll leave ethical subjectivism and moral ontology to you.
So, ethical subjectivism... we haven't talked about non-cognitivism, which is, I think,
Well, yeah,
we're
yeah,
falling over onto
sorry.
ontology.
I'll leave non-cognitivism to you as well.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, so
That's fine.
ethical subjectivism is just one form of anti-realism. So that means that there are no objective truths around the world. But nonetheless, they still say their moral statements are expressing propositions, but they're generally culturally or socially determined on the attitudes and the conventions of people, or even on just the individual. That most of them are relativist, therefore. So, if as a society in Denmark they say euthanasia is fine, then to them euthanasia is fine. But because the conventions and the norms are different in, I don't know, let's pick a nice place, Botswana. They say euthanasia is wrong. Wait, did I say it was right in Denmark?
Let's just say you hold the opposite position. Let's just say
they hold the opposite position. I'm messing around with this too much.
Okay, yeah.
Then that is wrong. Then there as well. That's wrong, but at the same time, it's also right somewhere else. So, you can have multiple truths, even if because they aren't objective, they're subjective. Then there's also there's universalist forms of this, which are a bit crazy, in my opinion. Well, not crazy as in exciting crazy. I don't agree with them, but ooh, sorry to anyone that's listening to that. So there's an ideal observer theory, which.
Oh wait, before we go into it, I just wanted to clarify. You might be confused as to how this links to the structure of evaluating it as true or false, if it's all relative and everything. But what the ethical subjectivist argues is that actually, yes, moral claims are true and false in the sense that if someone says murder is bad, they are expressing a claim that can be evaluated true or false. But the ethical subjectivist would argue you evaluate it to true or false in a very weird manner, which is to look at the person who says that and what they actually feel. Are they being honest? If they say murder is bad and they genuinely feel on the inside that murder is bad, then that statement is true.
I think I would disagree slightly there. I mean, I think I agree with you mostly, but I think it's important to look at the social and cultural biases as well as just
definitely.
the individual.
It's just useful to see,
definitely.
Because that's how ideal observer theory and divine command theory come in, because it's a correct evaluation of what the individuals believe extrapolated to the universe.
Definitely, yeah. So, ideal observer theory is that there is one individual, this imaginary hypothetical one looking out of the outside, who's perfectly rational, imaginative, informed, knows what's going to happen in the future and such, and they could then provide universal answers to moral questions. But it's only one person who's doing that, and thus it's subjective. And similarly, divine command theory, which we mentioned before, it's God that's doing that instead. So God provides the answers for us, but God has subjective opinions about.
If God likes it, then it's right.
If God considers it, considers it, approves of it, or so on. So you've done error theory. So non-cognitivist theories. It is not really not a good day for me saying things.
Don't worry.
Holds that ethical sentences are neither true or false because they don't actually express genuine propositions. So there's stuff like emotivism, which argues that we're not saying murder is wrong. We're saying I don't like murder, or boo on murder, or so on. They're just expressing emotions rather than actual moral statements. You can see why this is so it picks at the definitions and the sentences and the such. You can see why this is, if you know a bit about philosophy, this is a school of analytic philosophy, largely. And then there's quasi-realism, which argues that though ethical statements behave linguistically like factual claims, they sound like murder is wrong. In reality, there's no ethical facts for them to correspond to, and so thus they are just projecting emotional attitudes as if they were real properties. So it's got similarities to emotivism, but nonetheless they do argue that the statements act like factual claims on the surface, but underneath they are just emotional. And then there's universal prescriptivism, which is R.M. Hare again, who we mentioned before, who argues that actually when we're saying murder is bad or murder is wrong, we're saying don't murder. We're actually we're prescribing for the whole universe, and thus so it means that they have to be universalizable. Another thing, flashback to Kant there, and they do therefore have objective values, but they don't have a truth value. So they have this objective value of this is what, according to this person, they have objective values in the way this is how you should act. But they don't have an indicative value, so they don't have that descriptive this is wrong, because they are actually prescriptive. They're telling you what to do instead.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Should we move on to briefly just moral ontology, and you do that, Sully, if you want, or I can do it if you don't want to.
I can do it. You can do it.
You do a universalism. I'll do relativism. There we go.
Okay.
And then you can do nihilism.
Well, isn't nihilism part of moral epistemology?
So no, nihilism just argues that there aren't any moral, judgments at all. Moral facts or principles anywhere. I'd say.
Okay, so moral ontology, as we talked about before, is the study of the nature of our moral judgments, and whether they are to be held universally, to be held relatively, or in the case of the moral nihilist, to not be held as a standard at all, because there are no moral truths to the moral nihilist. And moral universalism is just the idea that some ethical evaluation could hold universally for all individuals. So, for example, my position on is murder wrong in this context may perhaps be true for all individuals, that position, rather than relative to one's cultural dynamics or whatever else. That's the whole idea of universalism. Something that can hold for all individuals a position ethically. Do you want to talk about moral relativism?
Yeah, okay. So I was just going to add, most universalist theories are forms of moral realism, but there are exceptions that exist. So even though there may not be objective facts, they can still be universal facts. For example, divine command theory. Even though God isn't objective, he is universal. Moral relativism, it maintains that all moral judgments are societal or individual, and thus moral judgments don't exist universally, but they exist on a smaller level. There's no objective nature of them, but they are they're limited to, like I said, societal or cultural views. Do you want to add some stuff? I think I'm not so familiar with metaethics, but if you've got anything else to add to moral relativism, you can, and then go on to moral nihilism.
Moral relativism is just the idea that everyone has different cultural contexts in which their situations apply, and which their values apply, and that all these cultures can, at the same time, all have a correct conception of morality while conflicting, because there is no objective sense of morality, and instead one should be weighed. Moral relativism is kind of the idea that one and their moral decisions should be weighed in accordance to their societal norms and views and values, essentially. So if your culture generally prohibits murder in all cases, and you are someone who murders someone, you have committed a morally incorrect act in that culture, in the relativistic sense. So,
and
we talked about
it's pretty tied to moral subjectivism, pretty much, because individuals and cultures decide what it is. But there are obviously exceptions, like I said, about divine command theory, because there is one individual subjectively interpreting it, but that becomes universal rather than relative, and thus provides a moral system for the whole world. Cool. Moral nihilism, you want to mention that? Go on.
Yeah, I just want to say, also, moral subjectivism doesn't have to necessarily be moral relativism, in the sense that one could be a moral relativist while being a moral subjectivist, in the sense that someone could recognize that different countries have different cultural values, but hold the position that I am going to dictate what's right and wrong based on the laws of my country. And that would be a moral relativist position, because laws vary between countries, but it would not be a morally subjectivist position because one isn't taking into account how they personally feel about certain acts. So that's an interesting distinction one can make.
I'm
And
not sure about that because
I read about it, so
uh,
I'm not sure.
oh, okay, well,
But go ahead.
I think I would argue that even though the individual isn't being subjective, then they're still not. It's like it's like divine command theory. You don't subjectively interpret it. God does, but you still take it, and but the law subjectively interprets it, and you take it instead. I don't know. It is a very debatable thing, and there's so many.
The law is mind independent, so.
But it was still created by someone else's mind.
Okay, yeah, that would make sense. Maybe, yeah, that's very.
It's like I was reading one thing and I got a completely different understanding of what moral subjectivism was to what Sully was doing. It's very debated. I like to go back into my comfort zone of normative ethics sometime soon.
Anyway, we'll come back to normative ethics. I think we have done everything
on meta ethics.
In the realm of meta ethics.
I feel that this may have to be its own separate. We should just cut this. We could maybe cut this bit out and put it in its own separate one because it was about half an hour long. So.
How many minutes do you think that meta ethics took? I think it took like 20 minutes.
Okay, well,
what would you say?
We'll see. Yeah, we'll see how it is. I mean, we've been going for 2 hours now, so yeah.
Okay.
Right. Okay, we're back to ethics in the modern day then, guys.
Yeah. So, ethics in modern day. Do you want to start? So
I think we've covered this quite well. I mean, there's been less of a focus on normative ethics. Academically, that is, we've covered this quite well. In terms of what people are focused on, less on normative ethics, more on meta ethics. Because honestly, you have to know if there are moral truths at all before you can try and start writing about what they are.
Yeah.
And the rise of analytic philosophies help that. And we've mentioned about virtue ethics becoming more popular. But individually, I suppose, we use ethics all the time and normative ethics systems, but many of us kind of conflict quite a lot. So you might say, no, I believe that murder is always wrong, no matter the situation. But then kind of simultaneously hold a position, no, I think going to war in wherever was the right thing because it promoted the most happiness for the most people. And so you've got conflicting systems there in place. So, I mean, that's just a nature of... and that's perhaps a good thing because we get that pluralist element. But you probably have a lot of very angry dead philosophers going, no, they're misinterpreting that, or no, they could just apply my decision making throughout all of society, and it would be great. But I like no, people don't do that. So you get some references to ethical philosophy, especially in politics. I think the what they did for the smoking ban a few years before our time, whatever, but they used arguments from Stuart Mill about happiness and the infringement of smoking on other people's happiness to justify it. So it is invoked, but most people's conception of morals is much less formalised than it is in as we've been discussing today. And they follow some degree of moral pragmatism, I believe, where you're not so bound up in the ideas that we express today. Pretty much what we've discussed is either academics and philosophers who hold these views like almost religiously, or weird people on Twitter who put that in their bios and then just make up their opinions on there religiously, as it were. So yeah, you go, Solly. You've probably got quite a lot to add.
No, I'll just say that most people. Well, this is going to link into our opinions of ethics soon, but most people hold a weird mix of all the different theories, which is why, in my opinion, trying to package morality into these neat boxes of normative ethics, different views, is kind of, not really that appealing to the normal person. It's not even appealing, for example, in my opinion, to myself, because I, for example, might hold a deontological position on we should not violate human rights, but when I'm confronted with saving lives, I'll take a utilitarian position. And if I'm confronted with how I want to generally act people in day-to-day life, I will be a virtue ethicist and trying to develop my kindness or compassion. So it's really everyone is jumping around the place with their ethics and trying to, as Bernard Williams would talk about, which he was a major critic of normative ethics. Um, we are such complex beings in relation to our morality, and it is a shame that we try to package it into these neat systems that don't reflect who we truly are as people. The differences in our moral judgments, and that instead we should just recognize our moral judgments for what they truly are, instead of trying to impose these systems. Describe how we feel about morality and talk about it in a constructive manner, rather than looking outside and taking ideas from others and forcing ourselves to conform our idea of morality to it, I'd say.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me, I'd say. So I guess we've kind of moved on to our thoughts and opinions now. So I suppose my opinion is, I mean, I was quite influenced by existentialism, but I suppose my view that we're not so self-bound as Sartre de Beauvoir says means I probably support some degree of virtue ethics society-wide. Obviously, I still don't consider there to be ethical. I consider myself an anti-realist in the sense that I don't think there are any moral truths beyond the ones that we create ourselves. But I don't advocate for utilitarianism. I think that society-wide decision-making should happen, and I think the character-based and thus much more flexible approach of virtue ethics is something that I'd favour. Favour. Oh dear, I don't think my tongue is working.
That's fine. You'd favour it, yeah.
Yeah.
The virtue ethics.
Virtue ethics. But I kind of agree. I don't think there are some abstract moral truths that we can gain. We just have to build it up from our own society subjective wide premises. And I think I would reject deontology for its impossibility in real life, I suppose, and the fact that so many of its rules are applied. It was made by Kant 300 years ago, whereas virtue ethics specifically is far more developing and flowing compared to something like that. And furthermore, and in addition, utilitarianism and other teleological schools, they're super. Either you get rule utilitarianism and then you're kind of not fighting with the same beast anymore, but or you get this kind of super subjective decay of morality, I suppose, into individual judgments, which I don't find very appealing at all. What's your thoughts? I mean, you mentioned quite a lot of thoughts just then, but have you got any specifically on any of the systems we've discussed, and then your wider view of ethics?
So my main issues with deontology and consequentialism, which is why you can already assume that I do subscribe to some form of virtue ethics. So my main problem with deontology is if we almost go to, this is going to be a really weird tangent, but if we go to the thoughts of people like Max Turner, which he was a individualist anarchist in the post left tradition, actually. He was a friend of Marx and of Hegel, actually no, yeah, whatever else. Anyway, he wrote that morality was a spook, which was this idea that morality was it was externally imposed to restrict us. And I think, in a sense, it does very much feel like that when you look at deontology. Deontology can sometimes feel like you're constantly being told what to do in a very rigid manner by someone else who was writing way before you. And same thing for, in a different sense, it's a very similar thing for consequentialism, because you can feel like everything is you're constantly being restricted by abstract ideas of well-being, and you might feel like you're being reduced to nothing more than a vessel of well-being rather than appreciated for your individual traits. And there's also the issues of sacrificing one for the many, and it doesn't feel intuitive in that sense. and that's why I do support a form of virtue ethics. And yeah, I definitely agree with you that I am not some. I'm a moral anti-realist, so my position on virtue ethics is a weird one. Um, I don't think there's a set of virtues that can fulfill what it truly means to be virtuous. Because I think that otherwise you'd just be following someone else's guideline for how to reach your own, self-development. Instead, I feel like people should go out there and find their own virtues and values, find what's important to them, as values. Maybe they will want the values of cooperation, compassion, kindness, the virtue of knowledge. Maybe they'll find that those are the ones they want to develop their character based on, and I think they should implement their own virtues and values into a virtue ethicist system to at least become the best person they can be. And I think that may be the best and most compatible thing with my own existentialist beliefs of finding your own way within the world, rather than letting other people tell you what the virtues should be, tell you how you should live your life. Because otherwise, if you let other people tell you this is what you should be as a virtuous person, you do let the issues of the other theories in not respecting the individual shine through again.
Yeah, I mean that definitely sounds familiar with what we were doing last week and the authentic choices that you have to make, free from living in bad faith or the various different reinterpretations of that. I think that's very powerful. I think I'm sure you probably agree with me, but I think the fact is that we're so socially determined that I don't think we can just leave it up to individuals to make that, and that what individuals have an important part to play, but there can be a more social element to that decision making. Yeah. But I'm sure you agree with me. We're just expressing it differently. Yeah.
Yeah. I think individuals. I don't believe that individuals should purely find the virtues they want to aspire to be by themselves. I think that use a mixture of things. Your intuition, how you feel. So how you feel. Use rationality. You use facts. Use external frameworks for morality, and you talk to people in your community on a social level about what values you share, and someone can convince you that, hey, this value you have of not wanting to care about people, it's kind of an unproductive one. It's a silly one, and I think there's a social element in helping, with other people develop your virtues so you can be a good person in that society.
Yeah, well, I think we've sold ethics there, guys. We can wrap it all up. Right.
Well,
yeah. I'm only joking. I suppose I would say that I understand that individuals are formed, like you're saying, and that they can come to their views socially. But I think that those parameters, the virtues you should be aspiring to, could also be set socially, which is, I think, where we differ. Whereas you would say they should be still done individually, but obviously based off social.
If the individual
elements.
accepts the social circumstance, in my opinion.
Okay. Cool. Right. Yeah. I think that's probably quite enough because we've been talking for 2 hours and 17 minutes now, and I'm sure you're very fed up of hearing our voice. So unless you've got anything else to add, have you got anything else to add?
Yeah. Next week, by the way, we're going to do probably
next fortnight. Next fortnight, man.
Next fortnight. Sorry, next episode.
Our viewers are going to be infuriated.
I'm sorry, viewers. We are very irresponsible. I'm very irresponsible. I'm not going to put it on Tom. Yes, next fortnight, hopefully, we will release a video, a podcast episode where we talk about the topic of modern politics and political systems and everything about everything to do with that.
Well, yeah. So I think we may be discussing some degree of political philosophy, but also I think a large part of it will be looking at political systems in the sense of constitutions and government and the relationship between the executive and the legislature, for instance. And that's philosophical, but it's a little bit a step away from the the kind of stuff we've been doing the last month or so. Last 3 weeks or so. And we'd love to hear your ideas as well. So if you've got any, send them in to the email, which is podcastnewdogsoldtricks@gmail.com. It's in the description of this video or somewhere on Spotify if we can get that to work.
Which we will.
We will definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think that's great then. See you guys. Well, we don't see you obviously, and you don't see us either. But we don't hear you either.
That's a form of,
you will hear us in 2 weeks'
This is
time.
quasi-realism, Tom. This is quasi-realism, Tom. You're projecting. This is fictionalism. You're pretending like a reality, which is not there, is the case. What can I say, Tom?
Well,
Anyway.
on that note, goodbye, and thank you for listening to the New Dogs Old Tricks podcast.
Thanks for listening. See you guys.